12th Infantry Regiment history. The 12th Infantry Regiment is a highly decorated unit in the United States Army that has distinguished itself through countless battles, multinational campaigns, and 7 major wars. Fighting on battlefields ranging from the quaint towns, rolling hillsides, and open plains of the United States of America to the sandy beaches and dense forests of Europe, to the deadly jungles of Vietnam, and most recently, the arid mountains of Afghanistan, the 12th Infantry Regiment stands ready to close with and destroy the enemies of the United States of America. In response to President Lincoln's call for volunteers, after the Confederate States of America fired on U.S. soldiers at Fort Sumter, South Carolina, the 12th Infantry Regiment was formed on May 3, 1861, to fight in the American Civil War. At a time when infantry regiments were normally formed through volunteers and organized by state, the 12th Infantry Regiment was notable for being formed through regular soldiers from across the nation. Regulars, with their superior training, leadership, and discipline, were held in higher regard compared to their state volunteer counterparts. This formation of well-trained soldiers set the foundation for the 12th Infantry Regiment to build the legacy we see today. The 12th Infantry's baptism by fire came at Gaines Mill, Virginia, on June 27, 1862. Here, the regiment faced off against veteran soldiers under the command of Confederate General Stonewall Jackson. The 12th Infantry Regiment held their ground through numerous vicious Confederate assaults, only being forced to withdraw during the evening as other sections of the Union line broke. The 12th Infantry, having sustained nearly 50% casualties while holding their portion of the line, earned a distinct reputation as hard fighters, a reputation and legacy that continues to represent the soldiers of the 12th Infantry to this day. The 12th Infantry continued to make a name for itself during the Civil War, fighting with the Army of the Potomac in numerous historic battles such as the Second Battle of Bull Run, Chancellorsville, and Gettysburg. During the Battle of Gettysburg, the 12th Infantry Regiment would advance to stem the Confederate attack on the southern end of the battlefield on July 2, 1863. Here they would check the Confederate advance before being forced to withdraw as they were outnumbered and taking fire from 3 sides. During the Civil War, one soldier from the 12th Infantry Regiment earned the nation's highest award, the Medal of Honor.
The citation for Private First Class John L. Yonker, Alpha Company, 12th Infantry Regiment, received the Medal of Honor for his actions at Cedar Mountains, Virginia on August 9, 1862. He voluntarily carried an order at great risk of life in the face of fire of grape and canister. In doing this, he was wounded.
Following the Civil War, the United States Army went through a large-scale drawdown. The 12th Infantry Regiment managed to remain on active duty and focused on refit and reorganization. In April 1869, 4 years after the end of the Civil War, the 12th Infantry Regiment was called back to duty. The soldiers of the 12th Infantry Regiment were sent to fight against the Native Americans. The regiment took part in multiple campaigns during conflicts with the Native Americans in the western United States. The first time the 12th Infantry Regiment saw combat against Native Americans in the West was in 1872. They fought against the Modoc tribe in California and Oregon. The second period of conflict was in 1878 against the Bannocks, which took place in Idaho, Wyoming, and Oregon. From 1890 to 1891, the 12th Infantry Regiment participated in its final campaign against the Native Americans. This conflict took place in South Dakota against the Sioux tribe. This campaign was the concluding act in a long drama between the U.S. Army and the Sioux that had lasted for decades, reaching its climax with the defeat of Custer at the Battle of Little Bighorn in June of 1876. Following the outbreak of war between the United States of America and Spain in 1898, the 12th Infantry Regiment was sent to Cuba to evict the Spanish from their last remaining territories in the New World. On July 1, 1898, the 12th Infantry participated in the Battle of El Caney. After suffering heavy casualties and being under constant suppressive fire from Spanish soldiers who were dug in on the high ground, the 12th Infantry, alongside the 25th Infantry, charged the enemy position on the hilltop. They managed to capture the enemy colors in a blockhouse, which was the key to the Spanish defenses. With this position controlled by American soldiers from the 12th Infantry and the 25th Infantry, the Spanish withdrew, sealing a victory for the American forces. With the Spanish-American War drawing to an end, the 12th Infantry Regiment was ordered to the Philippines. This was a former Spanish colony that was taken by the United States in the aftermath of the war. Arriving in February of 1899 on the main island of Luzon, the regiment soon went into action in the Malolos campaign, which is part of the Philippine insurrection. Later that year, the regiment would serve in the Tarlac and Luzon campaigns against both conventional and unconventional forces. With their combat role coming to an end in 1900, the 12th Infantry transitioned to an overseas garrison duty assignment. It would not return to the United States as a whole until 1912. The 12th Infantry Regiment did not participate in any major combat operations in the 1920s. They assumed peacetime garrison duties such as training, reorganizing, and re-equipping the regiment for future conflicts. In the summer of 1932, the 12th Infantry Regiment found itself responding to a domestic incident in Washington, D.C. A group of thousands of former veterans and their families, called the Bonus Army, had gathered in the city to protest. The Bonus Army was a group of World War I veterans who were suffering from the Great Depression and demanded early payment of promised bonuses they had earned fighting in World War I, which could not be cashed until 1944. With no money to spare, the veterans and the government reached an impasse. While the initial march and subsequent protests had been peaceful, tensions began to rise, and on July 28th, the protests reached a tipping point. Under the command of the legendary General Douglas MacArthur, with orders from the President of the United States to clear out the protesters, the 12th Infantry Regiment advanced. With bayonets fixed and firing tear gas, the infantrymen moved forward, supported by a cavalry regiment and tanks commanded by General George S. Patton. The protesters scattered, but not after 2 veterans were shot and killed. Hundreds more were injured, and masses of veterans had been arrested. Following the incident in Washington, D.C. with the Bonus Army, the 12th Infantry once again settled down into the dull routines of peace. However, this time, the country was at the height of a depression with a significantly decreased military budget. The conventional army went back to its foundation and focused on doctrine. This would all change on a Sunday morning in December of 1941, which would lead to one of the greatest chapters in military history, a chapter the 12th Infantry Regiment would play a large part in. With war once again at the forefront of the American people's minds, the 12th Infantry Regiment was ready to answer the nation's call. The 12th Infantry Regiment was assigned to the 4th Motorized Infantry Division out of Fort Benning, Georgia. The 12th Infantry would train as a motorized infantry unit in preparation for joining the war effort. However, due to different needs of the Army, the 4th Motorized Infantry Division was converted back to the 4th Infantry Division prior to departing for Europe. The regiment stayed stateside for 2 years at the beginning of the war, training hard in the Carolinas during the summer of 1942. Additionally, after being reconfigured to a regular infantry division in August of 1943, the men of the 12th Infantry Regiment would participate in battlefield maneuvers in Florida with an emphasis on amphibious operations. After conducting almost 2 years of continuous training, the 12th Infantry Regiment and the 4th Infantry Division received the call which they had long awaited. In January of 1944, the division was alerted for overseas movement and sailed for England. After they arrived in England, training did not come to an end. Fully knowing they were going to undertake one of the most dangerous and daring missions in military history, the soldiers of the 12th Infantry continued to execute a rigorous training plan for the upcoming mission. With the eyes of the world upon them and an extensive operation in hand, the soldiers of the 12th Infantry Regiment sailed for France. On June 6, 1944, now known infamously as D-Day, the 12th Infantry Regiment would participate in their first combat operation of the Second World War, Operation Overlord. Operation Overlord's goal was to establish a beachhead in northern France that would serve as a staging area for further operations to free the people of Western Europe and defeat the tyrannical regime of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party. In the early morning hours of June 6, 1944, after a colossal naval bombardment and continuous aerial attacks, the 12th Infantry landed on Utah Beach. The regiment suffered minimal casualties during their initial invasion due to weak German resistance primarily made up of poor quality conscript troops. Pushing further inland, the 12th Infantry managed to penetrate several miles before establishing a defensive perimeter at nightfall on June 6, 1944. After securing the beachhead, the 12th Infantry was assigned a new objective. The soldiers of the 12th Infantry, along with other American forces, were tasked with securing the fortified port city of Cherbourg, located approximately 30 miles to the north of Utah Beach. Advancing on the city, the men encountered heavy German resistance the entire way. As the 12th Infantry reached the outskirts of the city, the German resistance stiffened. The Axis soldiers used the urban environment to their advantage. After over a week of bloody fighting, enemy resistance and the city of Cherbourg was neutralized. With the battle for Cherbourg over, the soldiers of the 12th Infantry turned south to help the Allied forces fighting in the French bocage. This effort was to support the Allied forces attempting to break out into France. The breakout occurred at the end of July, allowing American forces to exploit the gap that was created in the German lines. After realizing the seriousness of their situation, the Germans launched a desperate attack on this gap, attempting to close it. The 12th Infantry found itself defending the area against a sizable German attack. The 12th Infantry fought off numerous waves of German attacks led by tanks and armored vehicles from the veteran 1st SS Panzer Division. The losses were so great on the German front that they were forced to withdraw from the fight. Following this defeat, and an even more disastrous defeat at Falaise, France, involving the encirclement and destruction of a German pocket of resistance, the Axis forces were on a full-scale retreat. In one of the most euphoric events in American military history, the 12th Infantry Regiment was one of the first American units to step foot in Paris. Here they were met with overwhelming support from throngs of newly liberated French citizens. Shortly after the 12th Infantry's entrance into Paris, they were called upon again. Advancing across France, the men of the 12th Infantry soon moved into Belgium and continued on their way into Germany. The 12th Infantry Regiment was pushed to the German border, where it found itself face to face with the vaunted Siegfried Line. This defensive network was a maze of intricate German fortifications that covered the entire length of Germany's western border. The 12th Infantry Regiment found itself mired in brutal combat with Axis forces for weeks. Eventually, the 12th Infantry were ordered to dig in and hold the ground they had just gained, executing their first large-scale defensive orders of the war. The 12th Infantry Regiment would soon be ordered north to participate in the battle that had stagnated in the Hürtgen Forest. Here, the 12th Infantry would fight in arguably their toughest battle, as well as the longest continuous battle ever waged by the United States Army. The Battle of Hürtgen Forest was a nightmare for the American soldiers. They found themselves attacking entrenched German positions that included chains of fortified German industrial towns and villages. These fortified positions were situated on rugged and wooded high ground, which included pillboxes, tank traps, roadblocks, minefields, and trenches. Machine gun and artillery positions were zeroed in on the limited avenues of approach offered in this thick forest. American superiority in numbers, artillery, armor, and most importantly air power were almost completely negated. The battle that raged in the Hürtgen Forest was an infantryman's fight. Joining the battle in the beginning of November of 1944, the 12th Infantry engaged in a violent, non-stop struggle with German forces that lasted nearly a month. Advancing from hilltop to hilltop, taking one fortified German position after another, the 12th Infantry found itself constantly gaining enemy ground while repelling constant German counterattacks. The men not only had to deal with the continuous stress of combat, they also had to fight against the harsh elements. Hundreds of men were forced off the battlefield with injuries such as trench foot and frostbite due to freezing rain and snow. The regiment was finally pulled off the line on December 8, 1944. By this time, the 12th Infantry had suffered over 2,000 casualties during their month-long battle in the Hürtgen Forest. Now deemed combat ineffective, the regiment was sent to a quiet section of the front in Luxembourg, nicknamed the Quiet Paradise for Weary Troops. The men enjoyed about a week of peace, with some of the veteran troops even allowed to get some much-needed rest and relaxation. While this was going on, new replacements were arriving and learning the standard operating procedures of their new units, such as patrolling and conducting reconnaissance. This break from combat was short-lived, as the soldiers of the 12th Infantry soon found themselves directly in the path of a large German counteroffensive, commonly known as the Battle of the Bulge, the largest and bloodiest battle in American history. Meeting the Germans head-on, the 12th Infantry inflicted a large number of casualties on German forces as they advanced on the Allied front. The battle was a success for the 12th Infantry Regiment. They severely delayed the German offensive. After days of continuous defensive engagements, the 12th Infantry, along with other Allied forces, launched a counteroffensive to regain the ground they had lost, inflicting serious casualties on the Germans. The Battle of the Bulge resulted in a decisive victory for the Allied forces. The 12th Infantry would earn a Presidential Unit Citation for the courageous actions against German forces during the Battle of the Bulge. After the Battle of the Bulge, the 12th Infantry would participate in the final offensive into the German heartland. Here, the soldiers advanced hundreds of miles, capturing dozens of towns and villages and thousands of prisoners. During this advance, the 12th Infantry Regiment continued to have engagement with groups of German soldiers. Pushing through the southern German countryside, the 12th Infantry stopped just short of the famous Eagle's Nest near the Austrian border, where they were relieved by the 101st Airborne in April of 1945. Shortly after, the 12th Infantry was pulled from the front lines and sent home. The men of the 12th Infantry arrived back in the United States on July 12, 1945. After their arrival, they were stationed at Camp Butner, North Carolina, to prepare for deployment to the Pacific Theater of Operations. With the war in the Pacific ending on September 2, 1945, the men were not needed for further operations. The soldiers' long and trying service in World War II had finally come to an end. The 12th Infantry Regiment had achieved significant objectives for the Allied forces, but it was at a large cost. The 4th Infantry Division suffered over 35,000 casualties, including over 22,000 combat casualties during 299 days of combat in Europe. After the war ended, the 12th Infantry Regiment was assigned multiple missions, one being a basic training unit in California. Following this assignment, the 12th Infantry was pushed back to the line. While on active duty, they did a rotation to Germany before returning to the United States and being stationed at Fort Lewis, Washington. Being reassigned and reorganized once again, the 12th Infantry found itself headed back to Germany in the summer of 1962 to be part of the Berlin Brigade. This was a force of American soldiers sent to occupy the former German capital of Berlin, deep in the heart of Soviet-occupied East Germany. These soldiers stayed in Germany through the Cuban Missile Crisis in October of 1962. The soldiers of the 12th Infantry were on high alert during this fragile time. They were ready for war. In 1963, the regiment was redeployed back to the United States and reorganized at Fort Carson, Colorado. The 12th Infantry Regiment once again answered the nation's call during the Vietnam War. In August of 1966, the soldiers of the 12th Infantry found themselves in a type of conflict that no American soldier in recent memory had ever fought in or trained for. Adding to the complexity of the situation, the terrain and weather were not advantageous to the United States either. The regiment served in several large-scale campaigns in Vietnam. They conducted operations throughout the country. On March 21, 1967, 212 Infantry engaged in their fiercest struggle in Vietnam, the Battle of Sui Tre. Here, soldiers from 212 Infantry faced the 272nd Regiment of the Viet Cong, one of the best trained and equipped Viet Cong units. After only 2 days of building a remote firebase, the American soldiers found themselves under attack. The Viet Cong initiated the attack in the morning with a barrage of 62mm and 82mm mortars. This was quickly followed by waves of Viet Cong soldiers attacking the entire perimeter of the base using machine guns, RPGs, recoilless rifles, and a variety of small arms. Parts of the American defense soon became overwhelmed from the Vietnamese onslaught. Withdrawing further into the firebase, the fight became even more desperate, lasting for hours. After receiving the call for support, soldiers from 212 Infantry and other American units arrived and broke through the Viet Cong positions. U.S. forces launched counterattacks and re-established the original perimeter. The Viet Cong forces continued to launch further attacks at the firebase until noon. Realizing the situation was hopeless, they broke contact and withdrew back into the jungle. As a result of the battle, there were 647 dead Viet Cong and over 100 individual and crew-served weapons captured. Unfortunately, 36 American soldiers made the ultimate sacrifice here. 2nd Battalion, 12th Infantry Regiment earned their 2nd Presidential Unit Citation for their heroism in this battle. After years of conflict and participation in 11 campaigns, the entire 12th Infantry Regiment would return from Vietnam in 1970. PFC Louis E. Willett, Sergeant Anon C. Rourke, and Specialist 4 Donald Evans, Jr. would posthumously earn the Medal of Honor for their heroic actions in combat during the Vietnam War as part of the 12th Infantry Regiment. Major Charles Litkey would also earn the Medal of Honor while assigned to the 12th Infantry as a chaplain for his actions during the Vietnam War. Evans Army Community Hospital in Fort Carson, Colorado would be dedicated in the name Specialist 4 Donald Evans, Jr. for the life-saving treatment he gave to several soldiers in a fierce firefight during the Vietnam War before he died from his wounds.
Private First Class Louis Edward Willett, C Company, 1st Battalion, 12th Infantry Regiment, 4th Infantry Division, was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor for his heroic actions during the Vietnam War. His citation reads, For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty, Private First Class Willett distinguished himself while serving as a rifleman in Company C during combat operations. His squad was conducting a security sweep when it made contact with a large enemy force. The squad was immediately engaged with a heavy volume of automatic weapons fire and pinned to the ground. Despite the deadly fusillade, Private First Class Willett rose to his feet, firing rapid bursts from his weapon, and moved to a position from which he placed highly effective fire on the enemy. His action allowed the remainder of his squad to begin to withdraw from the superior enemy force toward the company perimeter. Private First Class Willett covered the squad's withdrawal, but his position drew heavy enemy machine gun fire, and he received multiple wounds, enabling the enemy again to pin down the remainder of the squad. Private First Class Willett struggled to an upright position, and disregarding his painful wounds, he again engaged the enemy with his rifle to allow his squad to continue its movement and to evacuate several of his comrades who were by now wounded. Moving from position to position, he engaged the enemy at close range until he was mortally wounded. By his unselfish acts of bravery, Private First Class Willett ensured the withdrawal of his comrades to the company position, saving their lives at the cost of his life. Private First Class Willett's valorous actions were in keeping with the highest traditions of the United States Army and reflect great credit upon himself and the armed forces of his country.
Sergeant of None Charles Rourke, C Company, 1st Battalion, 12th Infantry Regiment, 4th Infantry Division, was posthumously awarded the military's highest award for valor, the Medal of Honor, for his actions in the Vietnam War. His citation reads, "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in action at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty, Sergeant Rourke distinguished himself by extraordinary gallantry while serving with Company C. Sergeant Rourke was the point squad leader of a small force which had the mission of rescuing 11 men in a hilltop observation post under heavy attack by a company-sized force, approximately 1,000 meters from the battalion perimeter. As lead elements of the relief force reached the besieged observation post, intense automatic weapons fire from the enemy occupied bunkers halted their movement. Without hesitation, Sergeant Rourke maneuvered his squad, repeatedly exposing himself to withering enemy fire, to hurl grenades and direct the fire of his squad to gain fire superiority and cover the withdrawal of the outpost and evacuation of its casualties. Frustrated in their effort to overrun the position, the enemy swept the hilltop with small arms fire and volleys of grenades. Seeing a grenade land in the midst of his men, Sergeant Rourke, with complete disregard for his safety, hurled himself upon the grenade, absorbing its blast with his body. Sergeant Rourke's magnificent leadership and dauntless courage saved the lives of many of his comrades and were the inspiration for the successful relief of the outpost. His actions, which culminated in the supreme sacrifice of his life, were in keeping with the highest traditions of the military service and reflect great credit on himself and the United States Army.
Captain Charles James Litkey, A Company, 4th Battalion, 12th Infantry Regiment, is an American who served as a U.S. Army chaplain in the Vietnam War and was awarded the military's highest decoration, the Medal of Honor. His citation reads, "Chaplain Litkey distinguished himself by exceptional heroism while serving with Company A, 4th Battalion, 12th Infantry, 199th Light Infantry Brigade. He was participating in a search and destroy operation when Company A came under intense fire from a battalion-sized enemy force. Momentarily stunned from the immediate encounter that ensued, the men hugged the ground for cover. Observing 2 wounded men, Chaplain Litkey moved to within 15 meters of an enemy machine gun position to reach them, placing himself between the enemy and the wounded men. When there was a brief respite in the fighting, he managed to drag them to the relative safety of the landing zone. Inspired by his courageous actions, the company rallied and began placing a heavy volume of fire upon the enemy's position. In a magnificent display of courage and leadership, Chaplain Litkey began moving upright through the enemy fire, administering last rites to the dying and evacuating the wounded. Noticing another trapped and seriously wounded man, Chaplain Litkey crawled to his aid. Realizing that the wounded man was too heavy to carry, he rolled on his back, placed the man on his chest, and through sheer determination and fortitude crawled back to the landing zone using his elbows and heels to push himself along. Pausing for brief momentarily, he returned to the action and came upon a man entangled in the dense, thorny underbrush. Once more, intense enemy fire was directed at him, but Chaplain Littke stood his ground and calmly broke the vines and carried the man to the landing zone for evacuation. On several occasions, when the landing zone was under small arms and rocket fire, Chaplain Littke stood up in the face of hostile fire and personally directed the medevac helicopters into and out of the area. With the wounded safely evacuated, Chaplain Littke returned to the perimeter, constantly encouraging and inspiring the men. Upon the unit's relief on the morning of 7 December 1967, it was discovered that despite painful wounds in the neck and foot, Chaplain Littke had personally carried over 20 men to the landing zone for evacuation during the savage fighting. Through his indomitable inspiration and heroic actions, Chaplain Littke saved the lives of a number of his comrades and enabled the company to repulse the enemy. Chaplain Littke's actions reflect great upon himself and were in keeping with the highest traditions of the United States Army.
Specialist 4, Donald Ward Evans Jr. was posthumously awarded the military's highest award for valor, the Medal of Honor, for his heroic actions in the Vietnam War. His citation reads, "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in the actions at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty. He left his position of relative safety with his platoon, which had not yet been committed to the battle, to answer the calls for medical aid from the wounded men of another platoon which was heavily engaged with the enemy force. Dashing across 100 meters of open area through a withering hail of enemy fire and exploding grenades, he administered life-saving treatment to one individual and continued to expose himself to the deadly enemy fire as he moved to treat each of the other wounded men and to offer them encouragement. Realizing that the wounds of one man required immediate attention, Specialist 4 Evans dragged the injured soldier back across the dangerous fire-swept area to a secure position from which he could be further evacuated. Miraculously escaping the enemy fusillade, Specialist 4 Evans returned to the forward location. As he continued the treatment of the wounded, he was struck by fragments of an enemy grenade. Despite his serious and painful injury, he succeeded in evacuating another wounded comrade, rejoining his platoon as it was committed to battle, and was soon treating other wounded soldiers. As he evacuated another wounded man across the fire-covered field, he was severely wounded. Continuing to refuse medical attention and ignoring advice to remain behind, he managed, with his waning strength, to move yet another wounded comrade across the dangerous open area to safety. Disregarding his painful wounds and seriously weakened from profuse bleeding, he continued his life-saving medical aid and was killed while treating another wounded comrade. Specialist 4 Evans' extraordinary valor, dedication, and indomitable spirit saved the lives of several of his fellow soldiers, served as a great inspiration to the men of his company, were instrumental in the success of their mission, and reflect great credit upon himself and the armed forces of his country.
The rest of the 20th century was relatively uneventful for the 12th Infantry. The regiment conducted training and managed to once again avoid the downsizing of the United States Army after the Vietnam War. The 1980s were a time of peace and prosperity for the United States. There were limited combat operations conducted by American forces, and none involved the 12th Infantry Regiment. Moreover, the 12th Infantry would not be involved in another overseas operation until 1994, when 1st Battalion, 12th Infantry would deploy to Guantanamo Bay, Cuba in August 1944, where they would provide humanitarian relief. These duties would include refugee camp security, distributing food and water, reparation of Haitian refugees, and being on standby in order to repel a possible refugee uprising. The unit would return to Fort Carson, Colorado in February of 1995. In December of 2001, just months after our nation was attacked by Al-Qaeda, elements of 112 Infantry would deploy to Kuwait and then Afghanistan, where they participated in combat operations for the first time in 30 years. 112 Infantry returned from deployment in May of 2002 and prepared for further deployments as the global war on terror was growing. 112 and 212 Infantry battalions would deploy in support of Operation Iraqi Freedom. 112 Infantry Battalion would deploy to Iraq twice. Their first deployment was in May of 2003 and lasted until February of 2004. Their second deployment to Iraq would be from the fall of 2005 to the fall of 2006. Both deployments for 112 Infantry were under the 4th Infantry Division in support of Operation Iraqi Freedom, focused on Baghdad. 212th Infantry Battalion deployed to Iraq for 15 months in 2006 and 2007 as a part of the 2nd Infantry Division. While in Iraq, both battalions would be involved in heavy combat operations, suffering heavy casualties. With the 12th Infantry combat role in Iraq winding down, and at the same time in the conflict in Afghanistan increasing, the 12th Infantry was prepared to move out. Following another reshuffling of Army units, both 1st and 2nd Infantry Battalions in the 12th Infantry Regiment were assigned to the 4th Infantry Brigade Combat Team, 4th Infantry Division at Fort Carson, Colorado. The 12th Infantry Regiment deployed to Afghanistan in May of 2009. 112 Infantry and 212 Infantry both owned battle space in different parts of Afghanistan. 112th Infantry Battalion would serve in southern Afghanistan just west of the strategic city of Kandahar in the notorious Arghandab River Valley. Kandahar was an important Taliban stronghold with the Arghandab River Valley known as the Heart of Darkness. 212th Infantry Battalion would serve in eastern Afghanistan's Kunar province near the border of Pakistan in the foothills of the Hindu Kush Mountains. Home of the Pech River Valley and the Korangal Valley, Kunar province would later be known to the American public as arguably the most dangerous place in Afghanistan. After a year of heavy combat, the regiment would return home with a Valorous Unit Award for 212 Infantry Battalion and a Meritorious Unit Award for 112 Infantry Battalion for the service in Afghanistan. In 2012, the 12th Infantry deployed back to Afghanistan in support of Operation Enduring Freedom. This time both battalions served in Regional Command East, with many of the soldiers of the regiment finding themselves back on familiar ground. Conducting operations similar to those on their previous deployments, soldiers found themselves in continuous firefights against a determined enemy. Both battalions would return home to Fort Carson, Colorado in December of 2012 after a 9-month deployment. In the years following, the 12th Infantry Regiment sent both 112 and 212 Infantry battalions back to Afghanistan multiple times each. The 12th Infantry Regiment deployed to Iraq and Afghanistan during the global war on terrorism in support of Operation Iraqi Freedom, Operation Enduring Freedom, and Operation Resolute Support. No matter what the mission set, 12th Infantry will always meet and surpass the standard. Anytime, any place, any mission, the 12th Infantry Regiment stands ready to defend the American people and defeat the enemies of the United States.
The 12th Infantry Regiment Crest. The field is blue for the infantry. This regiment took part in the Civil War. Its greatest achievement was its first engagement at Gaines Mills, Virginia, June 27th and 28th of 1862, where its loss was almost 50%. This is shown by the Moline crosses, which represent the iron fastening of a millstone, and the pair recall the crushing losses sustained. The wigwam with its 5 poles is for the 5 Indian campaigns in which portions of the regiment took part. The chief is for the Spanish and Philippine Wars, yellow and red being the Spanish colors that were captured at El Caney. The red and blue, the Katipunan colors, the embattled partition line, is for the capture of the blockhouse at El Caney. The sea lion is from the arms of the Philippine Islands. The distinctive unit insignia was originally approved on 20 June 1923. It was amended to change the blazon of the shield on 12 October 1965. History article written and narrated by Specialist Cedric Hill. Medal of Honor citation readers: Sergeant First Class Wesley Bradley, Private First Class Joseph Flournoy, Private First Class Demetrius Varonis, Staff Sergeant Cody Stanton, First Sergeant Matthew Collins. Crest symbolism read by Second Lieutenant Dan Liner. Having been led by love of country, steadfast and loyal, warhorse, lethal warriors, close with and destroy.